They dragged her through animal filth and laughed until a rider said, "Touch her again and you die." They called it Mercy's Fall, though no one could remember a time when the place had known a lick of mercy. It squatted low in a basin of dust and brittle grass, ringed by jagged red mesas that trapped the heat like a forge. The sun clung to the sky like a cruel overseer, and even the wind came sharp and hot, smelling of sand, dry sage, and old blood. Mercy's Fall was the kind of town a man could die in, and no one would bother to write his name on a headstone. In the late 1800s, the frontier was a place for men too mean or too desperate to live civilized. Mercy's Fall had its share of both. There was no sheriff here, not since old Marshall Doyle was gunned down in broad daylight and left to bleed out on the saloon steps. The nearest U.S. Marshal was a week's ride east, and none of the townsfolk had the stomach to fetch him. The law in Mercy's Fall had a name, and it belonged to Jud Wilks. Jud Wilks and his pack of murdering, whiskey-eyed outlaws ran the town like a pack of wolves. They drank for free, took what they wanted, and laughed when the meat complained. His gang wore their guns high and their tempers short, their hearts black as pitch. They'd strung up farmers for late payments, dragged drunks behind horses for sport, and took liberties with whatever or whomever they pleased. The townspeople endured it with heads down and doors barred, because resisting Jud Wilks meant dying slow. And yet, in every drop-blasted town, there's always one soul too stubborn to break. Adah Mercy had lived on the edge of town with her husband, Jacob, until the Wilks gang came to claim his cattle and put him in the ground 2 years past. Folks said Jacob was a fool for standing up to Jud's men, but Adah never apologized for the man he was or the land he fought for. She kept the ranch running with calloused hands and a back stiff as an iron rail, though every sunrise was a little harder than the one before. Adah was a woman in her mid-30s, her dark hair often pinned back beneath a faded kerchief, eyes the color of storm clouds before a downpour. Grief had sharpened her face, but it hadn't hollowed it. She walked like a woman who didn't care if death came for her, because she'd already made peace with him. On a gray-skied evening, with dust hanging thick in the air and the weight of coming rain on the wind, Adah Mercy strode through the swinging doors of the Dust Nail Saloon. The room fell near silent as she entered, the clatter of cards and the low mutter of drunken men faltering. Jud Wilks sat at his usual table near the hearth, boot propped up, drink in hand, his face a mockery of a grin. He was a thick-shouldered brute with greasy hair and a beard that clung to his jaw like moss on a stone. "Adah Mercy," he called, spreading his arms wide. "To what do we owe the pleasure?" Adah ignored the stares and made her way across the warped floorboards. "Came to tell you one last time, Wilks. You stay off my land." The saloon tensed like a cocked pistol. Wilks chuckled, taking a long drink from his glass. "Darlin', that land ain't yours. You just squatting on it till we get round to moving you off. Makes no sense, you bein' alone out there. Let us help you." He leered as the gang behind him laughed, yellow teeth flashing. Adah didn't flinch. She reached out, took the glass from his hand, and hurled the liquor into the fire, the flames crackling high. Then she slapped the man full across the face. The room held its breath. Jud Wilks' smile died, his eyes narrowing. "You just bought yourself a long, ugly night," he hissed. "I've had worse," Adah spat, and walked out into the gathering storm. Night came heavy, thunder muttering in the distance. The wind carried the scent of rain and fear. The townsfolk shuttered their homes and turned their lanterns low. They knew what came next. Jud's men found Adah alone in her barn, mending a fence rail by lantern light. There were 4 of them, grinning and mean. They dragged her out by her hair, through the yard where chickens scattered and pigs squealed. Into the street they hauled her, kicking and jeering, through mud and manure churned by days of livestock and human neglect. No one came to help. Faces watched from behind curtains and cracks in shutters. The saloon door stood open, men inside staring into their drinks. A preacher muttered a prayer he was too weak to make loud. Adah struggled, cursed them, spat in one man's eye. They laughed. "You got a mouth on you, Mercy." One sneered. "Let's see if it's still working after this." The sky split with lightning, a rumble like the growl of something old and angry rolling across the mesas. As rain began to fall, fat drops pelting the dust, Adah's dress clung to her bruised skin, and her hair stuck to her cheeks. But her gaze never lowered. She met each man's eyes, and if they saw fear there, it was buried so deep it might as well have been stone. Then came the sound, the hollow, steady clop of hooves on wet earth. From the east trail, a lone figure approached through the veil of rain. Mounted on a black horse with eyes like dying embers, the rider cut a silhouette against the stormy dusk. A long, dust-caked coat clung to his frame, his hat pulled low to shade his face. The outlaw slowed, watching him come. The townsfolk sensed it too. Something cold and heavy in the air, a hush falling over the street. The rider didn't speak. He drew up at the edge of town, water running from his hat brim, and sat his horse like a stone idol. The storm cracked again, and the night seemed to hold its breath. The rider sat motionless in the saddle, rain pouring off the brim of his weather-beaten hat in thin streams. His long duster, once a shade of gray or brown perhaps, was now slick with water and caked dust, clinging to him like the skin of some storm-born revenant. The black horse beneath him shifted only once, nostrils flaring as lightning forked above the mesas. Nobody in Mercy's fall recognized the man. Whispers traveled fast in a town that had no law but plenty of reasons to be afraid. From behind drawn curtains and the darkened corners of the saloon, the townsfolk watched him with something that felt like hope, but was too tangled up in fear to name. "Who in hell's that?" muttered Cal Harlan, one of Jud Wilks' brutes, adjusting the collar of his soaked coat. "Some drifter," snorted Gus Crowley, his face twisted in a sneer. "Ain't nobody's business. Get on with it." The gang laughed and returned to their sport. Adah Mercy lay in the muck, bloodied and mud-smeared, her face a defiant mask of battered pride. She didn't cry. She didn't beg. And when one of the outlaws, a lean, mean-eyed bastard named Jonas Black, lifted his boot to stomp her down into the manure-strewn street, the stranger spoke. His voice was low, gravelly, and carried through the rain like a hammer through glass. "Touch her again and you die." The words hung there, thick as thunder. Jonas hesitated, his boot hovering. The other men turned, the grin freezing on Gus Crowley's face. "What did you say?" Jonas spat, squinting through the downpour. The rider dismounted in one smooth, quiet motion. His spurs barely made a sound against the sodden earth. He walked with a kind of eerie, measured confidence that made men uneasy without knowing why. The gun at his side, a scarred and weathered cold peacemaker, hung low on his hip like it belonged there, like it had ended lives without ceremony. The stranger stepped closer, his face still shadowed beneath the soaked brim of his hat. But his eyes were visible now, sharp as cold gunmetal, unblinking, the eyes of a man who had seen too much and had learned to be unmerciful in return. "I said," the rider growled again, "touch her and you die." The street was dead silent save for the steady drum of rain against rooftops. Jonas licked his lips, hand twitching toward the pistol on his belt. "You best mind your business, drifter." Jud Wilks barked from the saloon porch, stepping into the half-light, his own hand hovering near the butt of his revolver. "Ain't no call for a stranger to get hisself involved in local matters." The stranger didn't flinch. Adah, bruised and panting, lifted her chin from the mud. A bitter smile touched the corner of her swollen mouth. "You're a long way from sense, Wilks," she croaked. "You shut your damn mouth, woman," Jud snapped, his eyes not leaving the rider. "Who in the blazes are you supposed to be anyway?" Gus Crowley demanded, trying to sound braver than he felt. No answer. The stranger simply kept walking, slow and certain, until he stood between Adah and the men. The townsfolk's murmurs grew in the darkness. Some of the old-timers started remembering tales told by drunks and madmen in the years before Jud Wilks took the town. Stories about a man, no, a ghost, who rode the frontier taking bounties on men other bounty hunters wouldn't chase. A killer of killers, a shadow whose name made outlaws leave their cards face down and back out of saloons. Matthew Kane, a name half believed, half feared, a gunman who vanished into the wilderness years ago and hadn't been seen since. "That can't be him," someone whispered. "Could be," answered another. "Eyes like a snake's," they said Kane had. And there they were, those cold, pitiless eyes. Jonas Black lost his nerve first. "Hell with this," Jonas muttered, drawing his revolver. A single motion. That's all it took. The stranger's hand moved, not quick so much as inevitable. His fingers curled around the grip of the peacemaker, drawing and firing in one fluid blur. The shot cracked like a whip. Jonas Black staggered, his gun falling from limp fingers as he clutched his wrist. A neat hole torn through it, blood pouring down his sleeve. Jonas howled, dropping to his knees in the mud. The other men froze. Jud Wilks' face darkened, fury mingling with unease. "God damn you," Jud hissed. "You got a death wish, stranger?" The rider cocked the hammer back again. The sound was like a coffin lid slamming shut. "No wish," he said, voice rough as a gravedigger's shovel. Wilks hesitated. The rain came down harder now, sheets of it bouncing off tin roofs, running down the dusty street in rivulets. For the first time, a tremor passed through the ranks of Jud's gang. "Call your men off, Wilks," Adah rasped. Jud's jaw clenched. He flicked a glance at Gus Crowley, then at the townsfolk peeking through half-open doors. Too many eyes now. Too much attention. "Back off," he snarled at his men. "We ain't done, Mercy. Reckoning comes at dawn." The gang pulled Jonas to his feet and retreated toward the saloon. Gus kept his gaze locked on the stranger's pistol the whole way, as if afraid it might leap up and speak again. Jud lingered a moment longer, measuring the rider. "You made yourself a mess of trouble, friend," Wilks said, voice low. "Hope you ain't fond of breathing come morning." The stranger didn't answer. When they were gone, Adah let out a ragged breath and tried to rise, her limbs trembling. The rider knelt beside her, his face still hidden, but his movements oddly gentle. He helped her up, steadying her against the storm. "Why?" she asked hoarsely. The man shrugged. Seemed it needed doing. She looked him over, noting the scar on his left hand, the old, worn revolver with notches on its grip, the battered duster. "Who the hell are you?" He gave no answer. "Matthew Kane," someone muttered from the saloon's shadowed doorway, voice thick with awe and terror. Adah's blood ran cold. She'd heard that name too, back when she was a girl, from her father, who'd worked cattle across the plains. Stories of a hunter who never left a bounty alive. The stranger didn't confirm it. He simply helped her toward the porch, letting her lean against the beam as the town whispered around them. A dozen pairs of eyes tracked his every move. The rain kept falling, and thunder grumbled over the mesas like the voice of something old and restless. The stranger reached into his coat and pulled out his revolver. Under the flickering lamplight of the saloon's overhang, he thumbed open the cylinder, checked the loads, spun it slow, then closed it with a flick of his wrist. The weapon was old, battered, but cared for, like a tool meant for one purpose. Whatever reckoning was coming at dawn, he would be ready for it, and Mercy's Fall would never forget what came riding out of the storm. The ride to Adah's homestead was a long, silent one. The storm had slowed to a persistent drizzle, and mist clung low to the ground, turning the dirt trail into thin veins of mud. Adah sat slumped in the saddle, clinging to the horn of the stranger's horse as he guided it steady through the night. Every jolt sent sharp pain through her battered limbs, but she made no complaint. The house came into view at the edge of the plain, a small, weathered structure leaning against the wind, surrounded by rough fencing and an empty corral. The barn door hung crooked on its hinges, and a single oil lantern flickered in the window, its glow faint against the night. The stranger helped Adah down, steadying her as she swayed on her feet. She gestured wordlessly toward the door, and he followed her inside. The air was thick with the smell of old wood smoke, liniment, and dust. Adah winced as she peeled the torn remnants of her dress away from her scraped knees and arms. The stranger crouched by the hearth, setting the kettle over the low fire before rummaging through a battered cupboard for clean rags and a bottle of whiskey. "Sit," he said, voice low, like the edge of a blade. Adah did, watching him warily as he knelt beside her with the bottle and cloth. "You got a name?" she asked. A faint grimace tugged at the corner of his mouth. "Names don't much matter." "They do to me." He hesitated, then poured a splash of whiskey onto the rag and began cleaning the cut on her cheek. His touch was careful, rough hand surprisingly gentle. "Kane," he said at last. Matthew Kane. Adah stiffened. The name hit her like cold water. Matthew Kane, she whispered. Jacob spoke of you. Texas, 6-7 years back. Kane gave a single, curt nod. I knew him. Rode together for a time. 1,000 unsaid things hung between them in the heavy air. Kane didn't offer more. He didn't need to. Adah could see it now, the familiarity in his posture, the burden in his eyes. He told me you were dead, she murmured. Wasn't far off. Kane poured a slug of whiskey into a tin cup and set it before her. Left Texas. Trail turned bad. Made promises I didn't keep. Adah's throat tightened. The fire cast flickering shadows across the rough walls, the only sound the hiss of rain against the windows. I buried Jacob myself, she said, her voice trembling now. Not one man in town lifted a hand. Just me and the preacher, and he didn't even stay to say words. I heard, Kane said quietly. Too late to stop it. Too late for a lot of things. Adah gripped the cup hard, the whiskey trembling inside it. I'm so tired of being afraid, Kane. I'm tired of them taking what they want, when they want. It was Jacob, then the Lanes, the boy from the mercantile, little Eli's folks, and nobody ever says no. A flare of something dangerous flickered in Kane's eyes. He took a long breath. They said no, he answered. They just died for it. Back in town, Jud Wilks held court in the Dust Nail Saloon. The air was thick with cigar smoke, spilled whiskey, and the kind of laughter that carried the taste of blood. Jud slammed a bottle onto the table, sending liquor sloshing over the edge. Tomorrow, he growled, I want that bastard's head on a pike. I don't care who he thinks he is. Nobody walks into my town and makes a fool of my boys. His men jeered in agreement. Cal Harlan and Gus Crowley threw dice against the wall, swigging from stolen bottles. Jonas Black sat cradling his bandaged wrist, his face pale and twisted in fury. I'll gut him, Jonas spat. I'll drag his guts across the square. Jud pointed a thick finger at him. You'll get your turn, but he dies at dawn. And that woman, she's mine. The room erupted in drunken shouts, cruel promises, and crude threats spilling like bile. Outside, in alleys and dim backrooms, the townfolk began to murmur. He faced down Wilks. One whispered. Drew on Jonas, shot him clean through the wrist. Another said, awe in his voice. He ain't like us. Old Widow Miller croaked. He's one of them dead men come back for reckoning. A few men, the ones who'd lost kin to Wilks, huddled in dark corners, hands on old hunting rifles and rusted pistols. Fear still clung to them, but something else had stirred. Something new. Hope. At Adah's homestead, a knock came soft against the door. Kane rose, his Colt loose in hand. He opened it to find a boy standing there, rain slicked through his hair and eyes wide with something between terror and admiration. Eli Lane. Couldn't have been more than 12, skinny as a fence rail, face bruised from too many beatings. I want to help, Eli said, his voice thin but steady. Adah started to protest, but Kane knelt, meeting the boy's gaze. You know what help means, kid. Kane asked. Eli nodded. I ain't scared. Kane studied him a long moment, then pulled a small, dull knife from his belt and pressed it into the boy's palm. Fear's not the problem, Kane said. Doing what's right when you're scared, that's the trick. Stay inside. Keep her safe. You see a face you don't know. You use this. Eli gripped the knife tight and nodded, his jaw clenched. As night deepened, the storm's edge rolled in heavier. Wolves howled out by the far hills. Kane moved through the homestead like a shadow, checking shutters, bolting doors. He laid out his weapons on the table, his peacemaker, a sawed-off shotgun, a long Bowie knife with a nicked, time-blackened blade. Adah watched him, noting how his movements spoke of old habits, honed in blood and dust. He pulled a battered pocket watch from his coat and flicked it open. Inside was a faded photograph, 2 figures, a young woman and a little girl. Adah saw the pain twist his face as he snapped it shut. Your family? She asked softly. He nodded once. Gone. Long time now, Kane muttered. Bad men. Same kind that live in every town like this. I was too far away. Promised I'd come back in time. He set the watch on the table, beside his weapons. I didn't. Outside, the wind moaned like a dying thing. They sat beneath the wide black sky later, after the preparations were made. Adah leaned against the porch post, a blanket around her shoulders, bruises dark against her skin. Kane sat on the steps, cleaning his revolver by lamplight. I'm afraid, Kane, Adah admitted, her voice raw. You'd be a fool not to be. But I won't run. He nodded, sliding the chamber back into place. They won't touch you again, he promised. Not while I draw breath. From the far trail, the glow of torches appeared, bobbing in the mist like fireflies. A distant sound of horses, men's voices raised in drunken anticipation. The wolves howled again. Kane stood, holstered his pistol, and pulled the hammer back with a steady click. Stay behind me, he told her, and Mercy's fall held its breath for dawn. Dawn came ragged and gray, a dull bruise of light bleeding across the horizon. Mist clung low to the streets of Mercy's Fall, curling around wagon wheels and fence posts, drifting like lost spirits through alleys and over rooftops. The storm had broken sometime in the dark, but the air hung thick and heavy, the ground sodden, puddles reflecting the pale, uncertain light. The town square was empty but for scattered storm debris, broken shingles, a splintered crate, a toppled hitching post. From every window and crack in doorframes, eyes peered out, faces half-shadowed, hearts pounding with fear and something else, a fragile, unfamiliar thing they hadn't dared feel in years. Then came the sound of hooves. Jud Wilks rode in at the head of his gang, flanked by a half-dozen hard-faced men. Their coats dripped rain, rifles resting across saddles, revolvers slung low. They looked mean, but even mean men could feel the weight of a place holding its breath. The mist swallowed the ends of the street, and the wind was still. Jud reined in his horse before the saloon, his face red with drink and rage. His voice carried sharp and cruel. Kane, you got stones enough to draw iron on my men. You got stones enough to show yourself now. Silence. A crow let out a ragged caw from the church steeple. The wet creak of a hanging sign somewhere down the street was the only reply. Then he stepped from the mist. Matthew Kane moved like a man, with nowhere left to go but through. His long duster clung to his frame, soaked through, the peacemaker riding low on his hip. His face, shadowed by the brim of his battered hat, was cold and unreadable, but his eyes told the truth of things. They were the color of cold iron and old sins. He walked to the center of the street, each step a quiet challenge, the mist curling around his boots. On a rooftop above, Eli Lane lay flat against the shingles, the stolen rifle steady in his small hands, eyes locked on Jud Wilks. His heart hammered, so loud he thought for sure the men below could hear it. "Goddamn fool," Jud snarled, spitting into the mud. "You come here to die, Kane?" Kane said nothing. One of Jud's men, Cal Harlan, laughed and started toward him, raising his rifle. The peacemaker cleared leather in a blink. The shot cracked, and Harlan's head snapped back, his body hitting the mud with a dull, final thud. A heartbeat later, Kane pivoted, and Gus Crowley died too, a hole dead center in his chest, his hand never reaching the butt of his pistol. For a moment, the street was nothing but the fading echo of gunfire and the sharp tang of powder on the rain-damp air. Jud's men hesitated. "Get him, you sons of bitches!" Jud roared, but there was no charge, no surge forward. The mist clung tighter, and then, impossibly, Adah Mercy stepped into the street. Her face was bruised, blood dried at the corner of her mouth, but she walked tall, shoulders squared, her dress torn and caked with filth. In one hand she held an old Winchester, though whether she could even fire it didn't seem to matter. "You've bled us for years, Wilks," she called, her voice carrying through the still air. "Taken our land, our sons, our husbands, our children. You murdered my Jacob, you killed Eli's folks, and we let you, because we were afraid." Her gaze swept across the saloon windows, the darkened homes, the faces peering out. "Not anymore." Another voice rose. Old Saul Duncan, who hadn't spoken above a whisper since his boy was left hanging outside the smithy. He stepped out, a rusted scattergun in trembling hands. "I ain't afraid of you, Jud," he said. Then another. And another. Men and women stepping from the doorways and alleys, clutching rusted pistols, hunting knives, and pitchforks. Not warriors, just people with no fear left to lose. The unease in Jud's gang turned to dread. "You stupid bastards," Jud growled. "You think this changes anything?" His men weren't listening. Some edged back, eyes flicking between Cain, the rising townsfolk, and the mist-heavy streets. The balance had shifted. And then came the last act. Jud dismounted, throwing his coat aside, and stalked forward. "You and me, Cain," he snarled. "Right now. You die here. You're just a ghost, a name in a bottle of cheap whiskey. This is my town." Cain's hand hovered near his Colt. Not anymore. They faced each other in the center of the street, the mist parting around them. The town held its breath. Jud's hand twitched. A bead of rain fell from the brim of Cain's hat. Then both men moved. Jud was fast. Cain was faster. A single shot split the air. Jud Wilks staggered, eyes wide, a black stain blooming on his chest. His revolver clattered to the mud. He tried to speak, but nothing came. He fell forward, face first into the street, dead before the mist swallowed the sound of his fall. The remaining outlaws broke. Jonas Black dropped his gun and fled, disappearing into the mist. The rest followed or threw down their weapons, the townsfolk closing in with shouts and old, trembling hands grasping for long-ignored courage. A rifle cracked from the rooftop. One of the fleeing outlaws toppled sideways, Eli Lane lowering the smoking barrel, his face pale but fierce. The boy clambered down, and the people cheered him like a warrior born. The storm had ended, but the air still smelled of powder and rain. Matthew Cain holstered his gun, his face unreadable, and turned toward Adah. She met his gaze, and in that look passed something heavier than words, a grief shared, a promise kept. The town stood silent for a long moment, the weight of years lifting, old ghosts retreating into the mist. And for the first time in a long while, Mercy's fall belonged to its people. The mist hung low, thick and heavy, though the storm had long passed. Dawn's pale light broke through the tattered clouds in streaks of soft gold, catching the rain-slicked mud and the still, lifeless form of Jud Wilks, sprawled face down in the dirt where he fell. Matthew Cain stood over the corpse, his coat clinging to him, rainwater dripping from the brim of his battered hat. The world seemed to hold its breath around him. The townsfolk lingered at a cautious distance, unsure whether to approach or leave well enough alone. Adah Mercy stepped forward. Her face bore every bruise, every insult of the past days, but her back was straight, and her eyes were clear now. The Winchester was still in her hands, though she no longer needed it. She stopped a few feet away, the silence between them as heavy as a funeral bell. "Thank you," she said softly, the words carrying more weight than 100 speeches. Cain tipped his head slightly. "I never asked your name," Adah added, searching his face. For the first time, he spoke it. "Matthew Cain." A ripple passed through the gathered crowd. The name moved like a ghost in the mist. Some flinched, some whispered, others simply stared, faces a tangle of fear, awe, and the old stories their fathers had told them by firelight. Matthew Cain, the dead man, the outlaw's bane, the bounty hunter who disappeared into dust and legend. An old-timer near the saloon spat into the mud. "I'll be damned," he muttered. Another man crossed himself. Cain's gaze swept over them, tired, cold, but sharp as ever. "You got a second chance today," he said, voice rough as gravel but carrying steady. "Use it. Keep to your own justice. Stand up when standing up's hard. Because next time," his eyes settled on a few lingering faces, "I won't be here." No one dared speak. Without another word, Cain turned to his black horse, rain still darkening the dust on its flanks. He mounted in a single, smooth motion, the peacemaker hanging low on his hip, and nudged the animal forward. The horse's hooves splashed through the mud as Cain rode down the street, past the corpse of Jud Wilks, past the battered saloon, past the lingering townsfolk who parted silently before him. At the edge of town, Eli Lane waited, the boy's face smudged with soot and rain, a look in his eyes older than his years. Cain slowed the horse, met the boy's gaze, and gave him a slight, approving nod. Eli clutched the knife Cain had given him like a badge. His thin shoulders squared. No words passed between them. None were needed. Then Cain rode on, toward the blood-red mesas, where the sun crested the ridgeline, bathing the canyons in hard, unforgiving light. In moments, he was a silhouette against the dawn, then a flicker, then nothing at all. The town exhaled. In the days that followed, Adah Mercy reclaimed her homestead. The fences were mended, the barn righted, and fresh earth turned for planting. No man dared approach her land with ill intent. She walked the town square as its people cleared wreckage and scrubbed blood from the dirt, the respect in their eyes hard-won and lasting. Eli Lane, orphaned and bloodied, became the boy people watched over now. He'd sit in front of the saloon in the evenings, whittling wood and listening to the old men's stories about Matthew Cain. Some said the boy had the same look in his eyes. Others whispered he was marked for something greater. And Mercy's fall, for the first time in a long time, belonged to its people. The legend grew with every telling, of the widow who faced down outlaws and rallied the broken, and of the rider who came out of the mist with death in his eyes and vanished with the dawn. Some swore they saw Cain's silhouette on distant ridges come sundown, watching, waiting. Others claimed he was long dead and it had been his ghost that saved them. But those old enough to know better said it plain. Matthew Cain never left. He rode the frontier still, a shadow on the wind, a name whispered where men did wrong and others dared not stand against it. And Mercy's fall would never forget the day the legend came home,